So yes, we are researchers, and that's what brought us together. We are also friends, and so any conversation we have does tend to run over. I think every single Zoom meeting we have, it's like, oh, we've gone like 15 minutes over. So we have a way of talking about research, but also thinking about and reflecting on just, our lives as researchers and moms. The project that brought us here today is our equity pedagogy research. And so we're going to kick things off by asking Brandi, why equity pedagogy here at Deeper Learning?
So I guess one of the things I would say is, to be clear, we didn't create equity pedagogy. It's something that has been around forever. Du Bois described equity pedagogy in the 1930s when he talked about sympathetic touch between teachers and pupils. But the terminology itself was coined in the mid-90s by James Banks. And what Banks said is equity pedagogy allows students to do two things, particularly minoritized students who are racially, linguistically, or culturally minoritized. It allows them or gives them the tools to function effectively within society and the tools to create and perpetuate a more just society. So if you were here at the talk a moment ago, they were saying that when you are doing PBL and deeper learning, what you're doing is making space or creating space for folks to make change. And that's exactly what equity pedagogy is trying to do, and that's why we are talking about it here at Deeper Learning.
So where we want to just sort of begin our conversation is, I hope you all noticed that we dressed appropriately for the occasion. We all have T-shirts, and to give you an idea of what it is we research within equity pedagogy is we really wanted to understand what are the pillars of equity pedagogy and how does it show up in project-based learning in particular. And there's sort of three facets to it that we're interested in looking at. It's good teaching, warm and demanding teachers, and criticality. And so we're just going to kind of talk through what each of those things are to get everyone on the same page. So I'll let Liz start.
Good teaching. So Gloria Ladson-Billings' article, "But That's Just Good Teaching," is where this name came from. All of these names are surfaced from the items that we put on the equity pedagogy scale that are developed from the literature. So as Brandi said, we didn't invent these constructs. We surfaced these ideas from the extant literature and then developed these scales. The good teaching items are what we often think of as Ladson-Billings said, that's just good teaching, right? So we have the foundational learning theories, going back to Vygotsky and zone of proximal development leading to Bruner and scaffolding, as we heard in the previous conversation, right? This is good teaching. This is a part of the good teaching construct. It's just not ubiquitous in classrooms that are serving marginalized students. So as Ladson-Billings raised the point, yeah, that's good teaching. Why is it not happening in this classroom? The other aspect of good teaching is culturally sustaining approaches. And there are several misconceptions out there that you hear, and I think one of the most important things that we talk about when we think of culturally sustaining and how it shows up in the classrooms is that the student is the expert, right? The student is the one who gets to teach the teacher about them, about their culture. And they have either community cultural wealth from their family that is leveraged and designed and worth being studied in school and built in. It's not the teacher's responsibility to know every single culture out there. It's the students who are the expert who get to teach their teachers. One of the items that we have on our instrument is my teacher gives me a chance to teach about me. And that's where that shows up. There's also a distinction when I think about this component of good teaching and when we think about culture and culturally sustaining, right? So whether you are thinking of, I think it's Hall who has the iceberg, right, of culture, where you have surface and deep culture. Zaretta Hammond has a tree with the roots in her book, Culture Responsive Teaching in the Brain. But what's common is this idea that there's surface level culture, right? Often we think of that as either the four F's or the 5 or the 6 F's, but it's food, flags, festivals, famous people, and fashion, right? That's not culturally sustaining. Asking your students, oh, where are you from? Oh, great, there's a famous person there. Let's color this picture. Not culturally sustaining, right? But getting to what we think of as deep culture, which is worldviews, orientation around family, and those aspects of funds of knowledge and community cultural wealth that inform those cultural assets that students bring that should be centered in the classroom.
And that aspect of good teaching really plays into the next aspect of equity pedagogy, which is warmth and demand. So the concept behind warmth and demand is we want to see our students do really well, right? Meet high expectations. But the only way to do that is to get to know your student first. You need to understand and build a relationship with them, and that can look very different. So when we say you need to be a warm demander, it doesn't mean you have to hug your kids every day when they come into class. It doesn't mean that you have to, say, I love you all the time to your kids, or, there are ways to demonstrate that warmth, that you understand them and that you're here for them. Maybe it's asking them how they're doing when they clearly look like they're having a bad day. And building that relationship before you dig into the academic piece of your work is really important because it builds trust with your students. And then when you have those high expectations or those demands to do the hard work, students are more likely to do it because they know you're not going to let them fail. Or if you fail, or if the student feels like they're failing, like that's okay, and I'm not judging you for it. I'm your teacher. I'm here to help you meet the high expectations, and I know you can do it because I know you as an individual. So that is the second piece.
And the final piece is criticality, which if any of you are familiar with Goldie Muhammad's work, that's one of the 4 pursuits or 5 pursuits in her framework. And when we think about equity pedagogy, which I'll kind of use as an umbrella term for culturally relevant, culturally responsive, culturally sustaining, culturally disruptive, all the different variations. Typically, criticality is the piece that's missing. It's the piece that people are the most uncomfortable with. It's the piece that folks may perceive as like trying to indoctrinate people. But really, what criticality is creating space to cultivate what I like to call prophetic imagination, so that children can think about the world as it is and the world as it should be, and how can I use what I'm learning to go from where we are to where I would like us to be. And when you see that in classrooms, it's often not something that it's not so much curriculum, but more the approach and the questions that the teachers are asking. So for instance, in one of the classrooms, we observed folks were making a budget, and they had all the same components in the budget that the state had, and they had to figure out their percentages for their budget, and then compare that to how the budget was actually done for the state. Well, one of the things the teacher stepped back and asked is, well, whose interests are represented in your budget? Whose interests are represented in the state's budget? Whose aren't? And then, why do you think they aren't? And so it gives the student space to sit back and really like pontificate on things like power and the distribution of resources. And it's not something that is discipline specific, because you can make space for criticality whether you are teaching math or social studies or science or English language arts, and all about just really not just thinking deeply, in terms of like critical thinking, but thinking about power as well. So Liz, what does equity pedagogy really have to do with project-based learning?
So PBL and equity pedagogy, in general, there is some overlap, right? We think of project-based learning, authentic context, student voice, also aspects of equity pedagogy. But PBL on its own is not inherently equitable, right? So if we think about the example you just gave, thinking about criticality or warmth and demand or good teaching, one of my favorite lessons that comes to mind is something that Dr. Goldie Muhammad designed in collaboration with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction on water. And so the first aspect when you think about good teaching, right, and getting to know your students is you lead into this exploration by first asking the students, what role does water play in your life and for you? And so that gives the student the chance to teach the teacher about them, the cultural significance of water, leads through, and this is a middle school lesson, but it could be adapted for anything. You go through the middle school science standards, learning about water, learning about the role of water, and then learning through the student's lens and the cultural assets that that student and their family bring. Then you're working through the lesson and you get to a criticality aspect, right? Who doesn't have access to water? What does not having access to water do on a fundamental level and a cultural level, the cultural significance, right? Then, as a society and as a whole, what does it mean to be good stewards of water? And throughout this lesson, you're incorporating authentic aspects of culture where you are highlighting the unique contributions of non-dominant groups. One of my favorite, did we work on this one? So we all talk about the NYU Metro's Culture Responsive Scorecard, right? Like they have one for STEM, they have one for ELA. It is fantastic. And it's one of those resources that you look at, and even when we're looking at our instrument designs, I recall we're like going through and like, oh yeah, they nailed that language. And so you have to be intentional with project-based learning, with all the aspects of deeper learning about these key components of equity pedagogy. Brandi and I, one of the papers presented at AERA like 100 years ago because COVID time, I don't know when this was. It was in Toronto, I think. But it was about equity pedagogy and project-based learning, and it was instructional weapons in a post-truth era. And the analysis you did examined exactly what we're talking about now, the role that equity pedagogy can play and the connection to project-based learning. I would love to hear a little bit more about how you see that project showing up in this conversation.
Yeah, so this was a long time ago, but what we looked at was student outcomes around their problem-solving capabilities and their perceptions of their exposure to project-based learning and equity pedagogy. And the findings were very interesting. So what we found is students who experienced project-based learning were excellent problem solvers. They were great at coming up with various solutions and testing them out. There was another component of the problem-solving outcome, which was recognizing and identifying problems that PBL did not necessarily predict. So being in a project-based learning classroom didn't necessarily mean you could pick out the problems, but the equity pedagogy was related to being able to recognize and define the problems. So what we concluded was when you put those two things together, now you have cultivated this student who can both function effectively within and create and perpetuate a more just society. So the two together could be incredibly powerful for creating that space for making those change makers.
Instructional weapons.
Instructional weapons.
Emily, do you want to share a little bit more about the PROBLES, the problem-based learning experience scale?
Yeah, so we did use this scale that looks at problem-based practices and equity pedagogy together, right? And we really wanted to understand how these features fit together. So we asked students, particularly like, what is their experience with their teacher? Did their teacher allow them to talk about themselves? Do they get a sense that their teachers care about them? And in what way did you see that happening, right? And could I ask, am I encouraged to ask hard questions? So that scale helped us sort of identify these three areas. And I think that one thing that we really want people to know about is, like, when we think about these aspects, we're not falling into a you poor dear syndrome, right? Which we see a lot in conversations about, well, how do we help these students who have been historically marginalized, have been treated poorly? And sometimes the response, even out of well-meaning people, is to like lower expectations, to expect less or modify in a way that makes the students feel good but doesn't actually help them progress in their learning or be challenged. And so one of the things that we found in the scale is, like, you have to do all of those things, right? You have to build a good foundation with your students and then also continue to demand of them the high expectations. And it might look different for each student, and each student might talk about how they're seen in a different way, but at the end of the day, they're still being encouraged to learn. And I think in our focus groups in particular, as we've been going to these schools and hearing students give very specific ways that they know their teachers care about them, where like we got that data from the scale that we used, the survey that we collected, but then the students gave voice to it. Here's what it means. Like, when my teacher saw me having a hard day, she didn't ignore it. She addressed it and still encouraged me to engage in the way that I could for the day, even though I was having a bad day. Or when I wanted to give up on a project because it was too much, I felt like I was overwhelmed, and I was like, I could just skip. I don't need to take that class. It's an elective. The teacher says, no, you have so many skills ahead of you, and what we need to do is work together to figure out how you can continue to work. We don't just give up because we don't need it. It's, you're growing here, and we're going to continue to help you grow. So I think that the scale combined with our qualitative research really helps us understand what it means to be a good teacher who is a warm demander, who's including criticality in the classroom.
I was just going to say one other thing as we think about students who haven't always been exposed to PBL. That very first project, like they just said in the Den Talk before, it's hard. But when you have that warm demander as a teacher, you are okay with the idea of failing and not getting it right, because you trust the teacher is going to catch you and be there to support you. So that warmth is necessary for that demand. And once that warmth is there, you can demand things and get things from students that you may not have thought was even possible before. Is that?
And Brandi, can warmth and demand be taught?
Yes, we did. Pass it everywhere.
We had this conversation yesterday as we're thinking about how do we write this article. It's a yes and no, because you don't need to be taught how to be a warm person. What you need to do as a teacher is to remember that your students are first, and to spend the time to develop that relationship. So how that looks like for you and for me may be very different, right? Like, if I'm having a conversation with anyone, I listen for something we have in common so that we can build that conversation together. Like, oh, you really like Abbott Elementary? Me too. Let's talk about that for a minute, right? Or whatever it is. So it's not that it needs to be taught, but I think it needs to be encouraged that teachers spend the time doing that, because we tend to get so obsessed with teaching for I don't want to say teaching for the test, but preparation, right? Meeting the academic outcomes of this class, the goals, the markers that we need to meet for this curriculum. And we want to jump right into that because we have so much to cover. But by doing that, we haven't understood our students well enough to get them to that point. So yes and no.
If you Google NYU Metro Culture Responsive Scorecard, they'll both come up. We used that a lot. So the literature that we use to build our instrument, and then also I work at New Tech Network, and we have a culture survey for students and educators. And the same way we developed these instruments is the same way we built our culture survey at New Tech, and that's looking at the literature, finding the ways that things are described. Like it is very hard to figure out the way to ask a question so that you get the student perspective. You can also then match that and get the teacher's perspective. So we certainly leverage the existing literature, and the NYU Metro Scorecard is one of my favorite resources out there.
Yeah, it was created by Leah Peebles, and she does lots of consulting on the side. But really what it is a tool that a group of educators could get together and kind of go through the curriculum and see whose voices are represented in curricular materials, and what types of approaches are represented in instructional design, and see what's there and what's missing, and how you can kind of fill in those gaps. It's an excellent tool.
And if you want copies of the New Tech Student Culture Survey and Educator Culture Survey and the instruments that we talked about, you can email, and we're happy to share them and send them out. It takes a lot of time to think of like the exact wording. I would spend like time writing like 10 words, and you really only need 2, but finding those exact 2 that make sense or at the appropriate reading level and communicate everything, it is hours. It is very, very challenging.
I can't. So he asked, what is the difference between Bell Hooks' engaged pedagogy and equity pedagogy? I think they are pretty much very similar. Bell Hooks was really talking a lot about the collegiate classroom, whereas the literature we used to build the equity pedagogy framework was more folks writing about K-12 classrooms, so leaning more on Gloria Ladson-Billings and Geneva Gay and Goldie Muhammad, whereas I put Bell Hooks' engaged pedagogy in conversation with Frank Tuitt's inclusive pedagogy, more really focusing on the collegiate classroom. But they are trying to achieve the same thing in those 2 different academic contexts. That would be my thought.
Okay. So I think there's a couple things. One is that as the leader, you really do need to know your people. And spend significant time actually seeing what they do and how they engage. It can't just be once a quarter I'm in your classroom. It's got to be very consistent. To start there, to give yourself, what's the word I'm looking for? An informal process. We have some rubrics that we are happy to share that really outline warm demanders and criticality in particular, that if you email us again, we'll be happy to share those with you, because it breaks down the components of what this might look like. And there's no scientific number about, if I hit these many components, then I know someone's a warm demander. But you can get a sense by looking through like, okay, well, their classroom is designed in such a way that it allows for this environment to happen, but maybe the things that are happening in their curriculum are not aligning. So those are great tools. And the other thing I would say is in terms of developing that, you can't do it all at once, right? So if you know your context well enough that, hey, I see that my teachers really know their students, they build great relationships. We were at a school that we won't name, I guess, but man, every teacher we saw knew their students so well, right? And their leader knew that because she spent so much time spending time with them. But she also knew that there were aspects that weren't fully there yet. Like criticality just wasn't there. So using the observation tool would be the first step, and then developing your PD on that so that it's manageable. You just can't do it all at once.
So one other thing I think to add would also be if you're using instruments and you're getting that student perspective, it's important to understand whose voices you have in your student data, right? So one of the things that we do with New Tech student culture data is we have a dashboard that's created where you can look and see, so that one item I talked about, my teacher lets me teach about me, right? We can look and say, okay, is it only white students that are responding positively to this? Do you have 70% of white students who are saying they're experiencing this, and less students of color, less black students who are having this experience? Because that's what Ladson Billings told us, right? She's like, yeah, this is good teaching, duh, we know that. It's not happening in the places we need it to happen. So unless we ask each of the students, are you experiencing this? We're not gonna know. And that's really important, is to look at the data about what is working and for whom.
Yeah, the other thing I would add to that is we have to think about teacher development as a trajectory. And so like teacher preparation is part, and then there's induction and continual professional development. And the school leader has a lot of influence on kind of those last two pathways. If the person who is in leadership makes this a priority, if equity pedagogy being employed in the classrooms is a part of the vision for the school, if it is like a non-negotiable, then you see that. So in that particular school, which remains nameless, it is obvious that every classroom we went in exhibited these things because that principal made that an expectation for the building. And then part of that also, in terms of, like you said, the structures and whatnot put in place. In one school, the principal said for the first week, they don't do any instruction. It is the plan that this is a get to know you week, and that's what we're gonna do, because that the leader prioritizes relationships and building those relationships. And so she said, we're not even going to start instruction until this particular point in time. Now, I'm not saying that's something that everybody can do, but they do it in that particular school. It works well, because what did we see in the classrooms at this school? We saw that warmth and demand. And so I do think there are a number of things leaders can put into place to let them know that this is part of the expectation of what happens here. I know this is like a hard thing, but if you haven't read it yet, check out Stuck Improving. It just came out by Dakota Irby. But one of the things Dakota talks about is building people's capacity to do equity work. And this is one of those things that has to kind of come first. So when we talk about having high expectations for every kid, part of that has to go back to unpacking what people believe about the kids in front of them. And that's work that has to be done as a part of the adult learning. And part of that learning sometimes is unlearning, and it's uncomfortable. It's the conversations that people are like, oh, well, we're just talking and we keep talking about the things, but you have to talk about the things to then change action. You have to change the beliefs. So once we can get folks to that baseline that Asa Hilliard said, where all kids are geniuses, and you trust that every child who steps in front of you is a genius, and then you understand that to teach the genius, all you got to do is love the genius and treat them like a human. That's Asa Hilliard, not me. But we got to get people there, and then we can add strategy. But that kind of has to be built in. And Yolanda Sealy-Ruiz and her racial literacy work has a lot in it to kind of help people move along that continuum and whatnot. But that's part of what has to happen in the adult learning too, that often we like to like skip over and say, oh, here's the strategy. But if in the back of your mind, you're like, I don't care what strategy you give me, little Johnny can't do this, then it's not gonna work.
Also, when we think about designing just in general professional development for adults, the practices that we know about good professional development, ongoing, revisiting, there is a spiral aspect to adult learning that we can't ignore. And so we have to keep touching back and revisiting on the same topics, just like if you have a spiral curriculum for 8th grade math. We have to keep doing that. And one of the designs within the adult learning space, when we look at Tom Guskey's work on professional development and evaluating professional development, is where does the change in belief and the change in practice and the change in action come, right? So you have beliefs, you have intentions, and you have actions. So you might have someone who's experiencing adult learning and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll try this in my classroom. Them just trying that in that classroom, that's an action, but is there belief there? Oftentimes, belief follows that initial attempt at action when they see the positive impact on their students. So you can have action, but that's not necessarily the indicator of belief. And that's why we have to have this ongoing adult learning spiral experience so that everyone has that chance to align along beliefs, intentions, and actions.
And just for one more resource, Muhammad Khalifa's book on culturally responsive school leadership has some really concrete questions and things to use to kind of help prime the pump and build that capacity, as well as Dakota Irvy's Stuck Improving.
The larger grouping, right? So when we looked at the literature to identify this instrument, we aren't saying that equity pedagogy is the sole owner of these ideas, right? There's this larger, and the actual full name of our instrument is the asset-based equity pedagogy scale, because there's this larger umbrella, right? And it's seeing and leveraging those assets. I mean, we were looking at other tools, other paradigms. There's a lot of focus on teacher instruments, teacher self-reporting, and the criticality component is often missing. And so it's not that equity pedagogy is necessarily different, it's that we pulled from all of these collections, all of these brilliant researchers, and surfaced, and it's actually very cool, because we used exploratory factor analysis on our list of items to see what components loaded, and it's the statistics is what emerged with these three constructs, right? So we looked at the literature on asset-based equity, and it's not like we said, oh yes, we see these three constructs. These three constructs emerged from a statistical analysis, where actually what's interesting is there are almost 4 factors that formed, but you can force the factor loading when you're doing an exploratory factor analysis, and you can see if you push them all into 3 factors, this is where the items shook out, and they're sorted by that same underlying concept, which emerged from the literature. So we didn't even identify these 3 constructs, SPSS did.
Can I? And I would say, just like Liz just said, equity pedagogy is more of an umbrella term. When James Banks wrote about equity pedagogy in '95, it was the same time you had Gloria writing about culturally relevant and Geneva write about culturally responsive. Then you got Paris coming up a few years later with culturally sustaining, and Emden with reality pedagogy, and San Pedro. And so you've got all of these brands, but they're doing similar things. And like, of course, when you're writing about it academically, you mention all of them and how they talk to each other. But they still have that same goal that Banks said back in the early 90s of making it so marginalized and minoritized kids can function in this society, and so they can make it better. And I think that's the main thing, that you get to do those two.
Thank you. I wish we had more time. This has been great. I have learned so much. Yay.